Welcome back to Crime Collective Vault, the channel where we take you inside the cases that official reports tried to close too quickly, and where the evidence, not speculation, decides what really happened. Tonight's case begins in a quiet residential driveway in Cullman, Alabama, a small city about 50 miles north of Birmingham. On the surface, this looks like a story you may have already heard. A wife, a husband, a gun, a late-night phone call to 911. But the deeper we dig into the official record, the more this case reveals itself as something far more layered than a single tragic night. Before we go further, if you want to follow every twist of this investigation as it unfolds, chapter by chapter, hit subscribe now. This case took investigators nearly 6 years to bring to a courtroom, and we're going to walk through it with the same patience the evidence demanded. On May 2, 2017, 32-year-old Tiffiney Crawford was found in the driver's seat of her van outside her family's home. She had been shot twice. Her husband, Jason Crawford, was the one who called it in. For a brief window that night, at least one responding official considered the possibility that Tiffiney had taken her own life. That theory would not survive contact with the physical evidence. Over the following months, forensic science, family testimony, and a series of decisions made in the earliest hours after her death would pull this case in a direction almost no one at the scene initially considered. This is not a story we're going to speculate our way through. Every detail you're about to hear comes from official investigative records, forensic findings, courtroom testimony, and documented public reporting. Where the record is uncertain, we'll tell you it's uncertain. Where witnesses disagreed, we'll show you both sides. Nothing here is invented, and nothing here is exaggerated for effect. The truth of this case turned out to be dramatic enough on its own. Over the chapters ahead, we'll walk through the night Tiffiney died, the choices made by the people closest to her in the hours that followed, the forensic findings that changed the entire direction of the case, and the trial that took place nearly 6 years later. Some of what you're about to learn will directly contradict what was first believed. Some of it may never be fully resolved. What we can tell you now is this: the case of Tiffiney Crawford would not stay classified as a suicide for long. And the reason why begins with a single detail investigators could not explain. A detail we'll take you to in the very next chapter. It was just after 11 o'clock at night on May 2, 2017, when a 911 dispatcher in Cullman County, Alabama, picked up a call that would take nearly 6 years to fully unravel. The caller was 37-year-old Jason Crawford. He was standing outside his own home. His voice, according to those who later reviewed the recording, was measured, steady. He told the dispatcher his wife had been shot. Within minutes, Cullman County Sheriff's deputies arrived at the property. What they found was Tiffiney Crawford, 32 years old, slumped in the driver's seat of the family van, parked in the driveway. She had been shot twice in the head, once on the left side of her jaw and once at her left temple. A pink revolver lay in her left hand. According to Jason, the gun belonged to Tiffiney. He said she kept it tucked into the driver's side door pocket of the van for personal protection. On the surface, in the confusion of those first few minutes, it looked like the kind of scene deputies have unfortunately learned to recognize. A body camera would later capture one deputy checking Tiffiney's wrist for a pulse. As he did, the revolver slipped from her hand and fell to the floor of the van. On that body camera footage, a deputy asked Jason a simple question: "What happened tonight?" Jason answered that the two of them had been arguing. He said he hadn't planned on letting her back into the house. He said the last thing he remembered was going inside, and then hearing a shot, a scream, and a second shot. At least one official on scene that night raised the possibility that Tiffiney had taken her own life. It was a theory that, for a few hours, seemed to hold together. A woman alone in her vehicle, a gun in her hand, a husband who says he was already back inside the house. But even in those early hours, something didn't sit right with everyone present. Tiffiney was right-handed. The revolver was in her left, and she hadn't been shot once. She'd been shot twice. A detail the responding coroner reportedly flagged to the sheriff himself as the one thing that felt off about the entire scene. There was another complication that had nothing to do with ballistics and everything to do with proximity. Jason Crawford's mother worked inside the very sheriff's office, now responding to her son's home. She would arrive at the scene that night as a mother, but also as a familiar face inside the same department, investigating her son. Because of that connection, Sheriff Matt Gentry made a decision early the next morning. He would hand the case over entirely to the Alabama State Bureau of Investigation, removing his own office from the process to avoid any appearance of a conflict of interest. It looked, on paper, like the responsible move. A local sheriff, recognizing a personal connection and stepping back before it could compromise the case. But that decision came one critical night too late. Because before any state investigator ever set foot near that van, something had already happened to it. Something that would follow this case through every courtroom argument that came after. And what happened to that van in the hours between Tiffiney's death and the state's arrival is where this story truly begins. After deputies photographed the scene on the night of May 2nd, the van containing crucial physical evidence was released back to the Crawford family. Think about what that means. A woman had died a violent death inside that vehicle hours earlier. And yet, before any state-level forensic team had the chance to process it, the keys went home with relatives. By the time Alabama State Bureau of Investigation agent Joe Parrish took over the case the following morning, the van had already been cleaned by family members. When Parrish later spoke about that detail publicly, his choice of word was notably restrained. He called it odd, not suspicious, not damning, just odd, that a family would move that quickly to scrub down the exact vehicle their loved one had just died in, before investigators had finished their work. There's no confirmed public record of exactly what evidence may have existed inside that van before it was cleaned, and we want to be upfront about that. What we do know is this: by the time state investigators were able to examine the vehicle themselves, whatever trace evidence might have told a clearer story was already gone. It's worth pausing here, because this is where narratives about this case start to diverge sharply. Jason Crawford's defense attorneys would later argue there was nothing sinister in any of it, that a grieving family cleaning a car is not the same as a family destroying evidence. And to be fair, they had a point that would echo throughout the entire case. Investigators never tested Jason for gunshot residue that night. His clothing was never seized. No search was conducted of the house. In other words, whatever the family did or didn't wash away, it wasn't the only gap in that night's investigation. For the prosecution, though, this early sequence of events became something else entirely. A pattern. A pattern of a scene that was treated, from its very first hour, less like an active homicide investigation and more like a family tragedy to be quietly managed. And that pattern raised a question that would follow this case for years. If Tiffiney Crawford's death was truly what it first appeared to be, why did it need managing at all? To understand why investigators would eventually stop believing the simplest explanation, we have to step back from that driveway entirely. We have to go back to who Tiffiney Crawford actually was, the life she had built, the support group she had founded with thousands of members, and the private conversations happening inside her marriage that almost no one on the outside ever saw. Because somewhere in that private life was the reason investigators would eventually stop asking what happened that night and start asking who wanted her gone. To understand why investigators would eventually walk away from the suicide theory entirely, we have to look past that driveway and into the years that led up to it. Tiffiney Crawford was, by every public account, a woman who had built something real. In 2013, she founded a local support group called Mothers Helping Mothers. By the time of her death, that community had grown into a network of thousands of members. She was raising 2 young children with Jason, and to anyone on the outside looking in, she appeared to be exactly what she presented herself as: steady, capable, and deeply involved in her community. But Tiffiney and Jason's marriage had not started as a simple love story, and it hadn't stayed simple either. Jason had come out of a previous marriage that ended over infidelity. Tiffiney had also been married before. 6 years into their relationship together, according to people close to both of them, cracks had formed that weren't visible from the outside. At some point before her death, Tiffiney began a relationship with another man outside her marriage. We want to be careful here, because public reporting on this detail is limited, and we're not going to invent specifics that haven't been confirmed. What is documented is this. A close friend later told investigators that Tiffiney had confided in her about wanting to leave Jason. She had taken a job at a nearby grocery store, specifically to start saving money for a life on her own. Her friend also said there was nothing about Tiffiney that suggested she was suicidal. Just one day before she died, Tiffiney met with a counselor. It was her first session. Friends would later testify that she had also been drinking more than usual in the weeks before, and that she was visibly upset after the man she had been seeing ended things with her. On the morning of May 2nd, the same day she would die, Tiffiney wrote in her personal journal. That entry would later be read aloud in a courtroom, years after she wrote it. In her own words, she said she was struggling with figuring out what to do with herself. It's a line that can be read 2 very different ways, and both sides of this case would eventually use it to argue 2 very different stories. Was it the private uncertainty of a woman working up the courage to leave her marriage? Or was it something closer to the edge, exactly what the earliest theory at the scene assumed? That question hung over the entire case for years. But what happened later that same day, in the hours between that journal entry and the 911 call that night, would matter far more than anything written on paper. Because sometime that afternoon, Jason Crawford discovered something about his wife that he had not known before. And what he did in the hours after that discovery is where this case takes its sharpest turn yet. By the afternoon of May 2nd, 2017, the day that would end with Tiffiney Crawford's death, something inside her marriage had already shifted, and neither she nor Jason yet knew that the other was aware of it. What exactly Jason discovered that afternoon, and precisely how he discovered it, isn't fully detailed in the public record. What is documented is the outcome. By that evening, Jason knew about the relationship Tiffiney had been having outside their marriage. That night, according to Jason's own account to investigators, the 2 of them argued. He would later tell Agent Joe Parrish that he confronted her directly. His words, as he recalled them, were blunt. He told her she had ruined their home, and that she was no longer part of it. By Jason's own account, the argument stretched on for roughly an hour. At some point in that conversation, Tiffiney asked him to bring out her work uniform. She had a shift the next day at the grocery store, the same job she had taken, according to her friend, specifically to build a life separate from him. Jason says he went back inside to get it for her, and this is the exact point where the accepted version of that night starts to fracture, because what happened in the minutes immediately after this becomes the single most contested sequence in the entire case. Also inside the house that night were Jason and Tiffiney's 2 young children, along with Jason's 14-year-old son from a previous marriage, Logan. Jason told investigators he sent Logan to call his grandparents and get them to the house quickly. That decision would end up mattering more than Jason likely intended, because Logan wasn't just a bystander that night. He was awake, and he was listening. Logan would later become one of the most closely examined witnesses in the entire case, not because his account was dramatic, but because of how precisely it lined up, or didn't line up, with the timeline everyone else was working from. According to Jason's defense team, Logan told investigators he heard his father come back inside the house right before the first gunshot rang out. If that's accurate, it would mean Jason was inside, not outside, at the moment his wife was shot. But that's not the only way this sequence has been told, and the gap between those two versions, what Logan actually heard, and what each side of this case says it proves, is exactly where the physical evidence would eventually be forced to settle an argument that eyewitness memory alone never could. Because outside, in the driveway, something happened to Tiffiney Crawford that no account, Jason's, Logan's, or anyone else's, could fully explain on its own. And the forensic team about to be called in was going to spend the next several months trying to reconstruct exactly what that was. By the time Dr. Valerie Green, a medical examiner with the Alabama Department of Forensic Sciences, sat down to review Tiffiney Crawford's case, the official theory had already started to wobble. Her findings would push it over completely. Green focused first on the wound to Tiffiney's left temple. In cases where someone shoots themselves, the muzzle of the weapon is typically close enough to leave visible signs: gunpowder stippling, scorching, sometimes even a contact burn on the skin itself. Green found none of that around this wound. Based on the absence of those markers, she concluded the shot to Tiffiney's temple had been fired from a distance of at least 10 inches away. In her own words, that meant Tiffiney would have had to hold her arm outward, well beyond the length most people can comfortably manage, and still land an accurate shot to her own head. Green was careful with her language here, and we want to be equally careful repeating it. She didn't say it was impossible. She said it wasn't likely. What made it even less likely, in Green's assessment, was something separate from the wound itself: the position of the van door. According to Jason's own account, when he found Tiffiney, the driver's door was closed. Green pointed out that inside a space that confined, physically extending a firearm 10 inches from your own head, while aiming precisely enough to strike your temple, becomes an even harder scenario to accept. There was a second wound to consider as well, one to the left side of Tiffiney's jaw. 2 gunshot wounds to the head is already an exceedingly rare finding in confirmed suicides. The medical literature on this is consistent enough that when investigators encounter it, it almost always warrants a closer look, not a faster conclusion. On March 8, 2018, nearly a year after Tiffiney's death, Dr. Green formally changed the manner of death. It was no longer classified as a suicide. It was now a homicide. That ruling didn't come with a name attached to it. Green's findings told investigators what likely didn't happen. They didn't tell anyone who pulled the trigger. For that, the case would need something Green's autopsy alone couldn't provide: statements, timelines, and a suspect willing or unwilling to answer for where he really was that night. And more than 2 months after Green's ruling, the Cullman County District Attorney's Office would take that exact question to a grand jury. But before any charge was filed, investigators still needed to sit across the table from Jason Crawford himself and ask him, directly, to account for the hour he says he spent arguing with his wife before she died. What Jason said in that room, and how he said it, would become one of the most scrutinized parts of the entire case. About a week after Tiffiney's death, Agent Joe Parrish brought Jason Crawford in for a formal interview. This wasn't an accusation yet. It was information gathering, the kind of conversation investigators use to pin down a suspect's account before the physical evidence has fully caught up. For the first time, Jason spoke in detail about what he'd discovered that day. He confirmed to Parrish that Tiffiney had been having an affair, and that the confrontation over it was what triggered the argument that night. He recalled telling her plainly that she'd ruined their home, and that she was no longer part of it. Jason's account of the timeline stayed consistent with what he'd told deputies the night of her death. They argued for roughly an hour. He went inside to retrieve her work uniform. And somewhere in the minutes after that, he says, she shot herself. We want to be transparent here about something. Public reporting on this case does not confirm every detail of what was discussed in that interview room, and we're not going to fill in gaps with invented dialogue. What we can tell you is the broader picture investigators were working from once that conversation ended. Parrish had already reviewed the 911 call multiple times by this point. What struck him wasn't what Jason said. It was how he said it. Parrish would later describe Jason's tone on that call as cold, not the voice, in his professional experience, of someone who had just discovered his wife dying in front of him. There was something else weighing on investigators as they built their case, something that had nothing to do with tone or timeline. It was the complete absence of certain evidence that should have existed if this was ever going to be provable as a homicide. Jason was never tested for gunshot residue the night of the shooting. His clothing was never collected. His house was never searched. Those weren't oversights investigators could go back and fix. Once that window closed, it was closed permanently. And Jason's defense team knew exactly how much that mattered. They would later argue, plainly and repeatedly, that there was no blood on him, no residue on his hands, nothing physical connecting him to the shot that killed his wife. For investigators, the case was left to stand almost entirely on what remained: Green's forensic findings, a friend's account of Tiffiney's plans to leave, a journal entry written hours before her death, and the memory of a 14-year-old boy who had been in the house that night, listening. More than 2 months after Dr. Green ruled the death a homicide, the Cullman County District Attorney's Office decided that was enough. On May 17, 2018, a grand jury indicted Jason Crawford. 4 days later, he turned himself in. But an indictment isn't a conviction. And what happened between Jason's arrest in 2018 and the moment a jury finally delivered a verdict would take nearly 4.5 more years. Years defined by a bond release, a defense strategy built entirely around what investigators failed to collect, and a trial where 2 competing medical experts would look at the exact same wounds and reach 2 completely different conclusions. Jason Crawford spent exactly 30 minutes in custody after turning himself in on May 21, 2018. He was released almost immediately on a $100,000 property bond. For the next 4.5 years, he remained free while the case slowly made its way toward trial. When the trial finally began in November 2022, both sides had built their entire case around the same handful of facts, interpreted in almost opposite directions. Prosecutors Jeff Roberts and Deborah Ball laid out a case built on motive and improbability. Roberts would later put it simply: he couldn't figure out who else could have done it. Jason was the only person with a documented reason to want Tiffiney gone that night, and he was the only person known to be there. Dr. Valerie Green took the stand again, walking the jury through the same findings she'd used to change the manner of death years earlier. She testified that the shot to Tiffiney's temple had likely come from at least 10 inches away, a distance she said made a self-inflicted wound highly improbable, particularly given the confined space of the van. But the defense had an answer to that, and it came from someone with real authority to challenge it. Robert Tootin and Nicholas Weatherly presented a pre-recorded deposition from a former chief medical examiner for the state, Dr. Lauridsen. His conclusion was the opposite of Green's. In his professional opinion, Tiffiney had shot herself first in the face, then a second time in the head. He also testified that it was impossible to determine the exact distance of that second shot, because her hair had obscured the entry wound. 2 forensic experts, the same wounds. 2 entirely different stories about what a human body was capable of doing to itself. The defense built the rest of their case around what wasn't there. No gunshot residue test, no seized clothing, no search of the house. Tootin reminded the jury, more than once, that there was not a single piece of direct physical evidence tying Jason to the shot that killed his wife. They also leaned into Tiffiney's emotional state in her final days. Friends testified she had been drinking more than usual, that she was distressed after the man she'd been seeing broke things off, and that she had started seeing a counselor for the first time just 1 day before she died. Then came Tiffiney's own words. Portions of her journal were read aloud in the courtroom, including the entry she wrote the morning of the day she died, the line about struggling to figure out what to do with herself. The prosecution and defense had spent years reading that same sentence in 2 different lights, and now it was the jury's turn to decide which one it believed. On the final day of testimony, Jason Crawford took the stand himself. What he said in that courtroom, under direct examination and then cross-examination, would be the last thing the jury heard before they were sent to deliberate. And after 4 days of testimony, a verdict on the death of Tiffiney Crawford was about to be reached, one that would either close this case for good or leave the exact same questions hanging that had followed it since the night in that driveway 6 years earlier. After 4 days of testimony, the jury in Cullman County had heard everything both sides had to offer. 2 forensic experts with opposite conclusions, a journal entry open to 2 interpretations, a 14-year-old's memory of sounds in the dark, and a defense built almost entirely on the evidence that had never been collected in the first place. On November 18, 2022, more than 5 years after Tiffiney Crawford died in that driveway, the jury returned its verdict. They found Jason Crawford guilty of first-degree murder. For a case that had spent years balanced between 2 plausible explanations, the jury's decision came down firmly on one side: the distance of that gunshot wound, the absence of scorching or stippling, the improbability of a right-handed woman firing 2 accurate shots with her non-dominant hand, in a space too small to extend her arm the way the physics required. In the end, that was what the jury believed over Jason's account of a closed door and a wife he says he never saw pull the trigger. Sentencing came several months later. On March 10, 2023, Judge Martha Williams sentenced Jason Crawford to 99 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 15. He is currently serving that sentence at Kilby Correctional Facility in Montgomery, Alabama. Jason's legal team has indicated they intend to appeal the conviction. As of now, that process is ongoing, and no outcome has been finalized. We want to be clear about that, because a conviction is not always the last word in a case like this, and we're not going to pretend otherwise for the sake of a clean ending. Jason Crawford has never changed his account. To this day, he maintains that Tiffiney died by her own hand, and that he was inside the house when it happened. His attorneys have echoed that position publicly, pointing again and again to the same gap that defined this entire case from the very first night. No residue test, no seized clothing, no physical evidence placing him at that van when the shots were fired. What convicted him in the end wasn't a fingerprint or a confession. It was a pattern of improbability, built one detail at a time, by people who refused to accept the simplest explanation just because it was the first one offered. Tiffiney Crawford spent years building something for other people, a support network that grew to thousands of members who never knew her personally, and yet leaned on the community she created. In the final months of her life, by every account she left behind, she was quietly trying to build something for herself too: a job, a plan, a way out. Whether the courtroom got every detail of that night correct is a question that will likely follow this case for years, through whatever comes of the appeal. But the physical evidence, once it was finally allowed to speak, told a story that a badge and a familial connection had almost let disappear entirely, along with everything that was washed out of that van before anyone with a badge from outside that county ever got the chance to look. If this case affected you the way it affected our research team, subscribe to Crime Collective Vault. We build every documentary the same way, fact by fact, source by source, without inventing a single detail to make the story feel bigger than it already is. There are more cases like this one waiting, cases where the official record and the truth didn't line up until someone was willing to look closer. We'll see you in the next one.